anatomy students. We're ready to continue our discussion on the cardiovascular system. We've spent a lot of time now talking about the heart, which, as you can imagine, is very important, but we also need to look at one of the other major components of the cardiovascular system, and that, of course, being the blood vessels. And so you probably know at least 2 or possibly 3 of the common blood vessels. There are actually a total of 5 different blood vessels, and so we're going to talk about what each of these do in the course of getting your body the oxygen that it needs and getting rid of the CO2 that it doesn't need. And so let us go ahead and get started. If we look on the left, we can see a depiction of an artery. I want to point out, in anatomy textbooks, typically arteries are colored red and veins are typically colored blue. I want to point out right now, there is no blue blood. And so unless there's a specific genetic disorder where there are people that have blue skin, but I'm telling you right now, there is no blue blood normally, so you have different shades of red. And so again, the reason the anatomy textbooks do this is so it's easier to distinguish the arteries from the veins. And so just kind of keep that in mind. Blood vessels form a closed circuit of tubes that carries blood from the heart to the body and back again. So it's constantly recycling the blood, and so it's making sure that your tissues are getting the oxygen that it needs in order to keep respiring, and also helping to take the CO2 back to the lungs where it can get rid of. All right. The vessels, there are 5 again. We have arteries, which you might have heard of, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins. And so I want to spend a little bit of time now talking about the function of each of these different types of blood vessels. Let us start with the first 2. We're going to look at both arteries and arterioles. All right. Arteries are strong, elastic vessels that are adapted for carrying blood away from the heart under relatively high pressure. And so the final topic, which we'll be talking about tomorrow, we'll be getting into talking about blood pressure. But I do want to point out that your arteries are strong enough to withstand the immense pressure it takes to get your blood through the whole entire part of your body. These vessels, these arteries, can then be subdivided into progressively thinner tubes and eventually give rise to finer branched arterioles. And so basically the arteries start to get a little narrower, they start to get a little bit more spread out, and so at that point they're no longer arteries and they're defined as arterioles. There are 3 distinct layers in the artery wall. I don't want you guys to worry too much about this. I'm just going to go ahead and tell you that the layers will then basically help in order to keep the blood from clotting. It'll also then have the smooth muscle fibers it needs for the ventricular contraction, and then it'll also connect to the tissues, to the arteries. And so again, don't worry about the names so much here, but I did want to bring up that a little bit. All right. I want to talk a little bit about vasoconstriction and vasodilation. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn to the seasons. And so we have spring, summer, fall, and winter. I'm going to take the hottest part of the year, summer, and I'm going to compare it to the coldest part of the year, which is winter. And so, as you can imagine, these 2 processes are here to help your body maintain internal body temperature homeostasis. And so let us look, for example, in the case when it is summertime. And so summertime, the temperatures tend to get hotter. Your body obviously doesn't need that heat. It wants to get rid of the heat. And so what it's going to do, the blood vessels will dilate. So they'll basically open up. And so by opening up, what this is going to do is it's going to cause heat loss across the epidermis to increase. And so another way that this can happen is by sweating. So your body will put down water on the epidermis. The heat from the blood vessels will then heat up the water to evaporate it, so it goes from the liquid water to water vapor. It removes the heat then out of your body, and so vasodilation would be the situation on a hot summer day. Now, in contrast, let's say, for instance, it's wintertime, and maybe you forgot to wear a heavy enough coat, and so now your body is starting to feel cold, and it needs to now keep the heat in so that it can maintain your normal body temperature. In that case, then, instead, the blood vessels will constrict, so they're going to get tighter, and so by getting tighter, it's going to keep the heat closer into the epidermis, and therefore there's going to be a decrease in the heat loss. And therefore, by decreasing the heat loss, it'll keep your body temperature warmer, and it will get then to the normal set point of 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius. And so these are two very important processes related to not only how your blood vessels work, but also in keeping your body temperature homeostasis. All right. I want to turn our attention now to the third type of blood vessel, and so these are called the capillaries. The capillaries are the smallest diameter blood vessels that connect the smallest arterioles with the smallest venules. Openings in capillary walls have thin slits where endothelial cells will overlap. As you can imagine, they're going to vary from tissue to tissue, and therefore it's going to also affect permeability. Typically, when you're looking at smooth, skeletal, or cardiac muscles, it's going to be smaller in diameter and smaller in permeability. In the case of your endocrine glands, your kidneys, your small intestine, they're going to be larger because, as you can remember, the kidneys are involved with your excretory or urinary system where you're getting rid of wastes. Your small intestine is involved with digestion. Endocrine is hormone secretion, and so in this case, you would want the permeability to be larger so that these things can escape out quickly. Gases such as oxygen and carbon dioxide, nutrients, metabolic byproducts are exchanged and moved through the capillary walls by either simple diffusion, filtration, or even by osmosis. So remember, osmosis is going from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. So again, think about the fact that it's easier to roll down a hill than it is to roll up a hill. And so again, the capillaries are the smallest of the diameter blood vessels, and this is the places in the body where you do have the oxygen and carbon dioxide being exchanged. So again, oxygen and nutrients come out into the body. The body then will put CO2 and wastes back into the red blood cells, and so then this is then going to then lead to a vein, which will then eventually lead back to the heart so that it can pick up more oxygen via the lungs. All right. I want to finally talk today a little bit about the other two types of blood vessels, and so we have venules and we have veins. And I want to also talk a little bit about what happens to some older people, particularly ladies, when they deal with what is known as varicose veins, what actually causes that to happen. This is going to explain that. Venules are microscopic vessels that continue from the capillaries and merge to form veins. So remember, the arteries will spread out to form arterioles. The arterioles will then form capillaries. The capillaries will then become venules. The venules will then become veins. And so it is all connected together in a closed system, just as we talked about at the beginning of today's lecture. Veins carry blood back to the atria and follow pathways roughly parallel to those of the arteries. And so typically, where you find an artery in your body, you're going to find a vein running parallel to it. And so oxygen going from your arteries down to the rest of your body, and then the vein is going to be coming then back to your heart so that it can then pick up more oxygen from the lungs. There is a really cool feature about veins. And so if you remember when we were talking about heart valves, the purpose of the heart valves, again, is to keep backflow of blood so that it goes in the right direction. In the case of veins, if we look over here, for example, we can see that there are also valves within veins that will also serve the same function as their heart valves, which again prevents the backflow of blood. And so for people, when they get older, these tend to get a little bit weaker. They tend to get weaker in the extremities, specifically down here in the leg region. And so older people sometimes end up getting what's called varicose veins. The reason they're so prominent is because these valves, which aren't functioning as strongly as they did in their youth, is now showing a buildup of blood, basically. And so if it gets bad enough, then you have to go in and get some surgical, somebody to look at that. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and end our talk on blood vessels. We have one final topic, and so tomorrow we will be discussing about blood pressure. And so I hope you all have a good rest of your